Once, in a land where tradition ran as deep as the veins of an ancient baobab, there stood Ebun University. It was a sanctuary of learning, where young minds were shaped under the watchful eyes of elders, and the echoes of ancestral wisdom blended harmoniously with the dreams of the future. The university was a beacon, not just of knowledge but of identity, a place where the students bore the weight of their heritage with pride, like an heirloom passed down through generations. But as the world beyond the hills began to shift, the winds of modernity whispered their way into Ebun University. In an effort to keep pace with the times, the institution entered partnerships with international bodies, sending its brightest students abroad to soak in foreign ideas like sponges dropped in a river. It was seen as a noble pursuit, a marriage of old and new, a leap into a future paved with promise. Among those chosen to represent the university was Abiola, a young man whose mind sparkled like sunlight on clear waters. His journey abroad was met with fanfare, and his parents, the elders, and even the town griot celebrated his departure as the start of a golden era for the village. When Abiola arrived in the foreign land, the stark contrast was immediate. The air was cooler, lighter, and the city thrummed with energy. Tall buildings stretched into the sky, and the streets pulsed with the rhythm of a life untethered by tradition. He felt liberated, a stranger in a land that embraced self-expression without judgment. In classrooms and cafes, ideas flowed freely, and every conversation seemed to challenge the norms he had grown up with. For the first time, Abiola was not bound by the rules of his culture. He saw love and identity as personal choices, not obligations. The freedom to be oneself, to speak one's truth without fear, was intoxicating. The old ways, the teachings of his ancestors, felt stifling now, like chains around his spirit. Abiola quickly adopted these new ideals. He felt the weight of his past slipping away, replaced by a belief that true progress came from breaking free of the past. The more he embraced this world, the more he distanced himself from the one he had left behind, convinced that the future lay in this bold new freedom. When he returned to Ebun University months later, his transformation was impossible to ignore. The once familiar campus now seemed narrow, like a cage that had constricted his mind. His old friends, those who had been part of the same cultural foundation, seemed to look at him differently. The pride of the past he had once shared felt foreign, and the weight of their expectations now pressed heavily on his shoulders. It felt like somebody had returned impersonating Abiola, and in fact, doing a very poor job at that. The boy who had left with reverence for his roots had come back with the fire of rebellion in his soul. Abiola's voice became a clarion call for change. He rallied students around ideas of personal freedom and liberation, advocating for what he called the breaking of old chains. His words lit a flame among the youth, a wildfire of thought that swept through the campus, igniting debates and challenging norms. Soon, Ebun University, once a temple of tradition, was awash with the colors of new ideals. The movement wasn't without its excesses. Under the banner of personal freedom, the students explored all manner of desires, turning their dormitories into dens of reckless indulgence. Nights that once hummed with the soft sounds of students poring over books now roared with laughter, music, and the clinking of bottles. Relationships sprouted like mushrooms after the rain, unrestrained by the rules that had once governed courtship. For some, it was liberation; for others, it was a slow descent into chaos. Moses was among those swept up in this tide. Once a diligent student with dreams as vast as the skies, he became a shadow of his former self. Parties replaced lectures, and the books that once occupied his nights now gathered dust under his bed. Moses began indulging in casual encounters, throwing caution to the wind in his pursuit of momentary pleasure. It was whispered that his dormitory had become infamous for its late-night gatherings, where alcohol flowed freely and boundaries dissolved under dim lighting. But the cost of such indulgence was heavy, and it came swiftly. Moses fell ill, a quiet sickness at first, then a relentless storm that ravaged his body. Rumors swirled as he became a fixture at the campus clinic, his once strong frame now a mere shell. When the diagnosis came, HIV/AIDS, it hit the campus like a thunderclap. Moses' rapid decline was both a tragedy and a warning, a symbol of what reckless freedom could reap. The university, once alive with the energy of youth, grew hushed. Fear seeped into the hearts of students as more cases emerged. What had begun as a pursuit of progress turned into an epidemic. The disease spread like wildfire, cutting down the brightest among them. The hospital beds of the nearby clinic overflowed, and the cries of afflicted students became a nightly lament. The air grew heavy with grief, and the once vibrant campus became a ghost of its former self. In the quiet corners of his home, Mr. Adiwale, a man of quiet dignity, waited for his son, Adebayo, to return from Ebun University. Whispers of the calamity had reached his ears, each tale more chilling than the last. When Adebayo finally arrived, there was no trace of the confident, ambitious young man who had left for the university. Instead, he sat before his father, his eyes downcast, his body trembling. "Father," Adebayo began, his voice as fragile as a spider's web, "I don't know who I am anymore." He spoke of the things he had seen, the choices he had made, and the friends he had lost. He admitted to falling into the same web of casual indulgence that had ensnared Moses and so many others. It was a confession that felt like the shattering of glass, a moment that stripped away all pretense. Mr. Adiwale listened in silence, his heart a storm of emotions. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of generations. "My son," he said, "freedom without responsibility is not freedom, it is chaos. We gave you wings to fly, but you must remember the roots that hold you to the earth." The next day, Mr. Adiwale withdrew Adebayo from the university. He believed the institution, once a source of pride, had become a breeding ground for ruin. He was not alone. Parents from all corners of the community began pulling their children out of Ebun University, fearing they too would fall victim to its unchecked freedoms. The movement that had promised enlightenment had instead brought darkness. Ebun University, once a jewel of the community, became a cautionary tale. The students who remained faced the dual burden of mourning their friends and rebuilding their futures. The elders, their warnings unheeded, watched with sorrow as the institution crumbled under the weight of its own excesses. As the dust settled, a question lingered in the air like the faint smell of smoke after a fire: what is the price of progress? Is it worth gaining the world if, in doing so, we lose the very essence of who we are?